Calder Hayes had always believed that a quiet life was the closest thing to peace a man could hope for in the West. His days were simple sunrise over the ridge, coffee strong enough to put dust in a man's veins, and the steady rhythm of ranch work that kept his mind calm and his heart steady. He wasn't the type to meddle in town affairs, nor did he care much for gossip or politics. Folks knew him as the man who nodded instead of spoke, who finished his business and rode home before the saloon lamps were even lit. But on the morning he rode into Sundown Crossing for supplies, the familiar stillness in his soul vanished the moment he heard angry shouts rolling across the street. A crowd had gathered near the courthouse, voices sharp, with something darker than curiosity. Calder kept his distance at first, wanting nothing more than to grab his feet and leave. But when he caught sight of 7 small figures beneath the gallows, the breath punched out of him. Children, Apache girls tied at their wrists, their faces pale with dust and fear, bruises on their necks, as if the rope had already tested them. The sight rooted him in place. Men in the crowd muttered words like traitors and spies. But Calder saw the truth in the trembling of the youngest girl and the hollowed strength in the eldest's eyes. These were not criminals. These were children, abandoned to the cruelty of men who needed a scapegoat. Slowly Calder stepped forward, his silence cutting through the noise in a way no shout could. When he asked what crime justified hanging girls barely tall enough to tie their own shoes, the men bristled, some reaching for their belts. But Calder didn't flinch. His voice remained calm, steady, almost gentle as he told them he would be taking the girls. No speeches, no threats, just quiet certainty. The moment stretched thin, as wire before the mob hesitated, unsettled by a man who refused to be intimidated. In that fragile pause, Calder acted. He strode to the gallows, cut the ropes, and lifted the smallest girl into his arms. And though he didn't know it yet, in saving them he had just stepped into the heart of a storm that would change the entire West. Calder Hayes didn't look back as he led the 7 girls away from the gallows, but he felt the heat of the crowd's rage burning between his shoulder blades. The moment he cut those ropes, he had crossed an invisible line, one drawn by powerful men who had expected no one, least of all a quiet ranchard, to challenge their judgment. As he helped the girls climb into his wagon, he kept his voice low and steady, telling them they were safe now, though he wasn't sure that was true. The oldest girl clutched the hands of the younger ones, her chin lifted despite the tremor in her lip. Calder noticed how they flinched at every shout behind them, every clang of boots on dirt. They had been terrorized long before the news touched their skin. When Calder finally climbed onto the wagon seat and snapped the reins, the murmurs of the crowd hardened into threats. Men he had known for years, men he had nodded to on quiet mornings, now glared at him with something close to hatred. "You'll regret this, Hayes," one spat. Another called after him, "They'll bring war down on all of us." Calder didn't answer. The girls didn't need to hear anger on top of fear. Instead, he guided the horses out of town, keeping his posture calm, even as unease twisted in his gut. But trouble wasn't done with him. As the wagon rolled onto open land, Calder spotted dust clouds behind him, 3 riders, following at a distance, not close enough to attack, but near enough to send a message. "We're watching you." Calder's jaw tightened. He had expected backlash, but not this quickly, and not with this intensity. Whoever wanted those girls dead had no intention of letting him interfere. He pushed the horses harder until the wagon reached his secluded ranch, nestled between 2 ridges. There, he hurried the girls inside, offering water, blankets, and a safe corner by the fireplace. Their fear slowly softened into exhaustion as the youngest curled against the others. Calder watched them, realizing he had just taken responsibility for 7 lives, and made enemies of men with far too much to hide. He locked the door, stepped onto the porch, and scanned the horizon. The riders were gone, but their warning lingered. Calder had rescued the girls. Yes, but, in doing so, he had become a marked man, caught in the first shadow of a conspiracy he didn't yet understand. Inside Calder's ranch house, the girls huddled together near the warmth of the fire, their small bodies wrapped in blankets far too big for them. For a long while, the room held only the crackle of burning wood and the sound of their nervous breathing. Calder kept his distance, not wanting to overwhelm them. He brewed warm broth, set out bread, and slid the plates toward them without forcing conversation. Slowly, hunger began to outweigh fear, and little hands reached hesitantly for food. "Saram, damatam alifta halam aram. Nido lukena kuka hualam. Nito kemluka lifte helbi, nito kalata yuk." Dema solo do alatilo, mover a mongali. Nito ke di awa palila, nito kalave palisa. She couldn't have been more than 14. But there was a steadiness in her eyes that spoke of responsibility far beyond her years. She swallowed hard, then began to speak in a soft, accented English, pausing to translate for the younger ones when their memories tangled in panic. Calder listened quietly, not interrupting even once. The story she told chilled him more than any winter storm. The girls had been gathering roots near the hills outside their camp when they heard unfamiliar voices echoing through the canyon, men speaking English and Spanish, arguing over crates too heavy for normal trade goods. Curious, the girls crept closer and saw something they were never meant to witness. Armed men hauling army-marked rifles and crates of dynamite into a network of hidden tunnels carved beneath the rocks. Others kept lookout, scanning the ridges with binoculars. The younger girls had frozen, terrified. Sensing danger, tried to lead them away quietly. They didn't make it far. A guard spotted movement in the bushes, and within minutes, the men had captured them. The girls were accused of spying, of gathering information for an Apache attack that Calder now realized was entirely fabricated. The men wanted someone to blame, someone to silence, and children were the easiest targets. Samali, Kambuda Luluwasa, Talaktin Nimp, Luluwata Lulasa, Taluluap, Luluap Tunoma, Luluwata Lula Lulowata, Nola Lula Lula, Luluwata, Nidoken Nagalinda Huida Luata. Idoken Naga Indahia Maimoto, Lola Mita, Wala Mulo Kundi Costa, Yonga Tolita, Wala Lulo Muka, Wak Twoda, Sayala Mola Mita Lula, Wasa Kungasida, Wala Lula Mila, Wasa Salapulo Madatalopola Said. She added one detail that made Calder's stomach twist. She had overheard the men mention a timetable, a plan to strike both sides soon. A staged attack, something big enough to turn settlers and Apache against each other in a storm of blood and revenge. Calder leaned back slowly, absorbing the weight of it all. These 7 girls weren't just victims of cruelty, they were witnesses to a plot dark enough to ignite the entire frontier. And now, because he had saved them, Calder understood one thing with absolute clarity. The men behind that plot would not stop until the girls and he were dead. At dawn, Calder saddled his horse with a steady urgency. The girls were still asleep, curled together on the floor, in a blanket nest like frightened birds, finally resting after a storm. He didn't want to leave them even for an hour, but he needed answers, and the law was the only place he could start. He left extra firewood, checked every lock twice, and rode hard towards Sundown Crossing with the cold morning air cutting at his face. "Mia, kamo Camilo talopa aktiatuvo mo wapahan. You can be mo," replied Itet. If what the girls saw was true, the West wasn't heading toward a skirmish, it was being steered into a war. When Calder pushed through the sheriff's office door, Sheriff Bram Huxley looked up from a pot of coffee with an expression that flickered from surprise to unease. Calder rarely visited town unless necessary, and never with the kind of storm burning in his eyes now. Without wasting time, Calder explained everything: the tunnels, the stolen weapons, the dynamite, the girls' attempted execution. He laid it out plain, his voice low, but edged with the urgency he could no longer contain. The sheriff listened or pretended to, but the more Calder spoke, the stiffer Huxley's posture became. When Calder finished, the room settled into a tense silence before the sheriff finally cleared his throat and set his coffee down with a dull thud. "Hayes," he said slowly, "you need to forget this. Forget it." Calder stared at him, stunned. The sheriff avoided his gaze and instead reached for a drawer, pulling out a ledger as if it suddenly needed organizing. But Calder caught a glimpse before the sheriff slammed it shut. List of names, ranchers, merchants, even a local judge. Names that meant influence. Names that meant money. Names Calder had heard whispered the day he rescued the girls. "Whatever you think you know," the sheriff muttered, "isn't your burden. Let the town handle its own." His voice held no authority now, only fear. Fear of the men whose names were written in that ledger. Calder realized then that the sheriff wasn't refusing because he didn't believe him. He was refusing because he already knew, and he was terrified. With the girls' lives hanging in the balance and the law compromised, Calder walked out of the office with a new truth burning in his mind. He was on his own, and the conspiracy was deeper and closer than he had ever imagined. Calder didn't waste time after leaving the sheriff's office. If the law wouldn't help and was likely entangled in the scheme, then he had only one option left: uncover the truth himself. Hamu, kabud the hamnont antara, as she soothed the younger ones. Calder assured them he was not abandoning them again. He simply needed to see with his own eyes what they had witnessed. Gasobia. Kambudo lulu awantilo, hamusamu ulovak. Tialo mudowaka yetomaliduwas ramosaya. Luluwosayuamo, itomanyuak, no lugalazed. Nidogenaga yindahilang, tapaloba mudu namo koratalamosaya. Yang kando mama mamodo moli saye, yindomotika momu mamowali. Nika moromo ke modala motala modaka, nika momota kode yumo, tamudi la moteliva pobo kuder sopala salie, amota kuala muapa pamota de sekti. Wer modila muapa muza motawo mulapato yamuka mabua katamo kakala. Noa pulamna papuvila motati lido la tola palo likati tamomo palasa visabu ayela patiko molo la patu ola pomola paku la pamno pupta pamomokato pamola talasap. He couldn't risk exposing them again. Instead, he had her draw the path in the dirt, the ridgeline, the slope, the hidden bend where the canyon mouth narrowed. Her memory was sharp, and the map she traced with her fingertip was precise enough to guide him straight into the heart of danger. Lulu salamungang dasako nao lula maraba, watumo andewo kamahengulamo. Lulu ka lokong sabowe salamo dahalai. Hulaki lambad, the land grew harsher the deeper he went, jagged stones, narrow passes in silence that hung in the air like a warning. When he reached the canyon, the tracks were still there, wagon ruts, boot prints, and the drag marks of heavy crates. Calder dismounted and moved on foot, keeping low, letting the natural bends of the rock shield his approach. Then he saw it, a sliver of darkness cut into the Kenyanwala tunnel mouth, hidden behind scrub and cleverly stacked boulders. The air coming from it was cool and metallic, carrying the faint smell of oil and gunpowder. Calder slipped inside, letting his eyes adjust. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows over piles of stolen army rifles, ammunition crates, and stacks of dynamite arranged with chilling precision. Maps were pinned to a rough wooden table. Calder leaned in, his pulse pounding as he studied them. Arrows marked planned Atson settler towns, Apache camps, and military patrol routes. Each strike was timed to implicate the other side, igniting a cycle of revenge that could consume the entire territory. This wasn't just smuggling. It wasn't simple banditry. It was a war being manufactured for profit, for power, for the men whose names Sheriff Huxley had tried to hide. A sudden echo of footsteps from deeper in the tunnel snapped Calder back to the present. He extinguished a torch with his bare hand, stifling a hiss of pain, and slipped into the shadows. He'd seen enough to confirm the girl's story and enough to know he'd just stepped into the crosshairs of men willing to burn the West to ash to achieve their ambitions. Calder had barely slept after returning from the hidden tunnels. The truth he'd uncovered gnawed at him like a wolf, at bone-stolen army rifles, crates of dynamite, and maps marking attacks designed to set settler against Apache until the entire frontier drowned in blood. He spent the early hours checking the locks, making sure the girls were safe, their small bodies curled into blanket bundles on the living room floor. But even as the fire crackled softly, Calder sensed the danger creeping closer. The men behind the plot would not ignore a rancher who had seen too much. By mid-morning, the warning arrived. Hoofbeats, steady, unhurried, confident. Not the reckless pounding of hired guns, but the measured trot of someone who believed he had nothing to fear. Calder stepped outside, tension coiling in his muscles. A glossy black carriage stopped at his gate, its wheels polished, its curtains drawn. When the door swung open, Judge Mortimer Vale emerged, with the calm authority of a man used to shaping destinies with a stroke of his pen. Vale smiled, warm as a winter sunbright, but offering no heat. "Mr. Hayes," he greeted, strolling forward as though visiting an old acquaintance. "I hear you've taken on a delicate situation." His gaze drifted toward the house, just long enough to confirm he knew exactly who was inside. Calder said nothing, his hand resting near his holster. The judge continued, his tone silky. "Those girls were caught trespassing on government land. Dangerous territory. Dangerous consequences. You've put yourself in a difficult position protecting them." The air shifted subtle, but sharp enough for Calder to feel the trap closing. Vale wasn't here to inquire. He was here to intimidate. Calder asked plainly what the judge knew of the tunnels. Vale's smile didn't falter, but the light in his eyes hardened. "Some matters," he said, "are above the concern of one rancher. Leave them be." That was the moment Calder understood beyond doubt. Vale wasn't just involved. He was in charge. The judge signaled with 2 fingers, and suddenly his carriage guard and driver stepped forward, both armed. They seized Calder before he could draw, forcing him to his knees in the dirt. "You should have stayed quiet," Fale murmured, crouching close enough that Calder could smell tobacco on his breath. Silence keeps a man alive. Curiosity buries him. But Vale miscalculated. Inside the house, 7 pairs of eyes watched from behind the curtains, 7 girls who refused to lose the man who saved them. And they were about to act. The moment Judge Vale's men dragged Calder to the ground, the girls knew they couldn't stay hidden any longer. "Sahiya, kan mo daw lulo sa kinakaso saya mo? Lulu sa kanesa kando marovi mo sivi, loma si vila si viradi sindapotini kabitalos sadi, wano kam na yomu pate shua sa pate tala. Numa sate dimos, uma rivila mate US kadi. Una mata iwa palilam, ungwa pate modalo, numati kovata luta kemosa. Imos kuta bate potadi pirom pate mo takamo kuta. Yumate kopata ilpatite matamo karaki, window wakate patalapiza patekamo, kanti kopate movi kamo katapo kimatala. Wando makali sitamo katamo kilamo pate popumotatamo kato kumulkorumo pasiat. One by one they slipped out like shadows, circling behind the barn where Calder kept his tools. "Muaska, kataya halarama, kanmaluna kamosa." Now it was their turn, while they gathered what they could rocks. A rusty wagon pin, an old slingshot Vale tightened his grip on Calder's fate. He stood over him, straightening his coat as though preparing for a speech. "The Apache will strike at dawn," he said. Almost conversational. "My men will fire first using those rifles. Settlers will retaliate. Chaos breeds opportunity, and opportunity enriches those smart enough to create it." Calder's glare didn't waver. "You'll start a war that'll kill innocent people on both sides." Vale's smile was thin. "Sikoa. Wapadelo mulo kamosem, lomokilo kanabi, wapatamu. Lumoviam, lumo lala lukali ese kamomo. Nulomo wat apo luam. Nito kinakamo talakabo. Nido kinaki mo kamo witaluko. Witoki labon almo tasa yung kipos kurakapoli. Hiya momo aparesta lalu sa iyang. Wismo price before di kutakam ni sa imomo kata. Ismo price mo kota lipo pokipu kolalata mo kopapomu. Ikodea mo papo wichubo putatu tamo paluki kumo komotakula potamuta koputukolu akotupalutata. Then chaos erupted. A rock struck one guard across the temple, sending him stumbling. A slingshot pellet snapped against the judge's shoulder. Another girl darted out, swinging the wagon pin like a club. It didn't do much damage, but it distracted them long enough. Calder lunged upward, slamming his shoulder into the guard holding him. The man toppled, and Calder wrestled his gun free. A single warning shot cracked the air, freezing everyone in place. Vale's composure fractured. He backed away from the children as if they carried fire in their hands. But the judge hadn't come alone. Ten at least armed and ready. Anantia's face paled. Calder pushed the girls behind him, his mind racing. They couldn't defend the ranch against an entire militia. They had to reach the town fast. He ordered the girls onto his wagon, snapping the reins as Vale's men descended. Bullets tore through the dust around them, but the horses surged forward, hooves pounding like thunder. Calder didn't look back. The girls clutched each other, eyes wide with terror, as the wagon raced towards Sundown Crossing. The church bell was already ringing when they arrived in, with for worship, but alarm. Townsfolk poured into the streets, confused, frightened, unprepared, and Calder, standing atop the wagon with dust on his face, and 7 terrified girls at his back, shouted the truth loud enough to crack the quiet morning. "They're trying to start a war. Judge Vale is behind it, and these girls are the proof." The town froze caught exactly between the truth Calder carried, and the violence Vale was ready to unleash. The west balanced on a knife's edge, moments from burning. The morning sun rose blood-red over the ridge, as Calder Hayes and the 7 girls faced the final confrontation. Sundown Crossing had emptied into the streets, townspeople clutching rifles, pitchforks, anything they could use to defend themselves. Or at least witness the truth. Judge Mortimer Vale, furious and cornered, had retreated to the hidden tunnels with his remaining men. The crates of stolen rifles and dynamite, now an inferno waiting for a spark. Calder knew there was no time to waste. He led the girls toward the hills, weaving through the ridges, each step calculated. The dynamite and weapons had to be neutralized, and the judge stopped at nothing. Salah saya sinas, kamu satang boras sumo lamua. Mi poro kami karasaying, rumulasa mo kamasiyala pitalakolu, lokalaktua liam tora sayala palati, recalling every twist and turn she had memorized. They approached cautiously, the air heavy with gunpowder and the metallic tamps of bloodless violence. Inside, Vale's men fired blindly, the echo of gunshots bouncing off the stone walls. Calder took cover, returning fire when necessary, but his focus remained on the explosives. He spotted the fuses and, with a mixture of nerves and resolve, began dismantling them one by one. Sparks from a fallen torch caught a stray powder trail, igniting a small explosion that rocked the tunnel. Calder shielded the girls, his body pressing them to the stone as the cavern erupted in fire and smoke. Vale's rage was cut short as the tunnels collapsed behind him. Trapped, disarmed, and powerless, he could only watch Calder and the children escape into the light. Outside, the townspeople had surrounded the ridges. Witnessing the destruction and understanding at last the depth of the plot, Calder held the girls tightly, their small hands clutching his coat as dust and debris settled around them. By evening, the town recognized Calder's bravery, and word spread across the frontier. The Apache chief, having been apprised of the rescue, came personally to express gratitude, offering his respect and friendship. The girls, once doomed, were celebrated for their courage and resilience. Their story a reminder of innocence, saved from a world teetering on greed and cruelty. Calder returned to his ranch, the quiet life he had cherished once seeming possible again, but never the same. The girls were safe, the plot destroyed, and justice had been served, though not without cost. Yet in his heart, Calder knew he had done more than save 7 lives. He had preserved the fragile peace of the West and given hope to those who had been counted out. As the sun set over the horizon, Calder stood on his porch, 7 girls laughing softly nearby, and felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of belonging, of purpose, and the knowledge that even in the harshest land, courage and compassion could ignite change more powerful than any fire.